Well, welcome back to the Communication Mastery Podcast with me, Mark Berlinson. This is where we unleash the power of understanding to build bridges and not boxes, because we understand that communication is the soil in which teamwork grows. And this week I've got a focus for you on the power of storytelling, because storytelling can really grow our communication mastery. It can increase the connection with our audience, whoever that may be, whether you're talking a small group or a large group. The power of story really does make a difference in your communication. And so I want to talk a bit about how to craft a compelling narrative, how to build that bridge with the people who are listening to you, whether it's one person or many. The first thing I want to underline about storytelling is the power of engagement, because it's a story that will captivate your audience. It's a story that will make whatever you're speaking about, the information you're conveying, it'll make it more memorable, it'll make it more relatable. And so stories have the power to engage where facts often don't. And there's also, secondly, the power of connection. Because when you tell a personal story, it fosters connection, but it also builds trust with your listeners, your hearers, your audience. And really, connection is the goal of communication mastery, isn't it? We talk a lot about how to create effective connection and strong connection. So when you're thinking about the power of story, choose a story that will be relatable to your audience. You don't want to choose a story that is it's something they don't understand or something they don't connect with, but also include in that the power of vulnerability, because this is a personal story. If you can be as transparent as you can without being out of the park with the details, but if you can build a connection through vulnerability, that's a very powerful connection. The third thing that story can do is it can bring clarity and simplification. If you've got a complex problem to solve, or you've got a complex idea to put across, you can distill that complexity into a simple, relatable narrative. And that can be easier for your audience to connect with. They can understand the story and maybe get the point of what you're getting across without some of the big words that would be required if you were discussing it just on a factual level. So if you've got something difficult to communicate, maybe see if you can find an analogy that helps you to illustrate the key points of it, and then turn that into a story. It's something I do quite often when I'm coaching clients. I find an analogy that helps them to see, oh, I get what you're talking about, or I get where you're taking me with this. And that helps them to move forward. So clarity and simplification is a third powerful way that storytelling can really help. The fourth thing that storytelling can add to your communication is the whole thing of inspiration, motivation. You can inspire people very easily with a well-crafted story. They can inspire action. They can motivate your audience to pursue their goals, or maybe to change their behaviors, because they see the power of this story. Because the story will take them on a journey, they can take that journey for themselves in response to the story that you're telling. Personal accounts of success are especially powerful because they show that change is possible. But don't just tell the story of the success, tell the story of the struggle that led to the success, because no success comes without work before it, does it? And that's why we meet like this on the podcast, because we're ready to do the work that will lead us into success in communication. A fifth area that storytelling can really be valuable is in persuasion. If you're involved in any way in sales or in persuading people in other ways, maybe promoting a cause, then a well-crafted story can really help. I know a lot of folks who are in the non-profit arena, and they love to tell stories. The successful ones tell the stories of what's happened through their organization or through their mission, lives that have been touched, people who've made a difference, stories that turned out well because there was the involvement of the community. Those kinds of things really can persuade audiences to adopt new perspectives, or to change their opinion, or to support a good cause. You know, empathy is a very powerful change agent. And so stories that evoke emotion, that touch the heart and not just the head, Those are especially valuable in that sort of context. There are two other ways that storytelling can help, and the first of those would be in memory retention, helping people to remember something, because we forget facts and figures, we forget details of how to do things or what to do that's right or what will be better. When it's just facts, when it's just information, it tends to go in one ear and out of the other. But when you hit the heart with a story, we remember stories far longer than simply facts and figures. So if you want to create a memory in others, then a story is the best way to do that. And then the final area where stories can really help is in evoking cultural significance, where you can reflect cultural values or cultural beliefs. Where you talk, for example, here in America, we talk about liberty. Because that's been part of our nation's history. It's been part of the story of what makes America, America. And when we tell those kinds of stories, it touches something deep inside of people that goes back before even before their own story, and gives them a foundation to build on. It allows audiences to connect with their heritage or to understand the perspectives of others as well. I love to hear stories from First Nations peoples where they tell the story of how they grew into such a powerful society. Now, history, of course, has not been fair to the First Nations, but hearing the stories from the past really can evoke an emotional connection with those peoples and to draw from their storehouse of wisdom that we can bring into the present and learn from. So storytelling really enhances communication because it makes it more engaging, makes it more relatable, it makes it more impactful. And as I've outlined, you'll find your interactions are far more effective if you can add stories to your communication in some relevant ways. Let me give you an example from my own life. As a newborn, I suffered with a condition called pyloric stenosis. That's where one of your stomach valves doesn't operate the way it should, and it causes projectile vomiting. I know that's disgusting, I'm sorry, but it resulted in me being hospitalized for several weeks as soon as I was born, and that separated me from my parents. And because they care deeply for me, you can imagine the strain in their lives, the difficulty of being separated from this baby that you've been waiting to meet, and having him in a hospital, in an intensive care unit. That was a terrible strain for them. And the doctors were wrestling to find a solution to this problem. My parents, as they visited, were holding on to hope that a solution could be found. They had me baptized to affirm their faith that I could recover and would recover. And after about 6 weeks in the neonatal ICU, a pioneering operation solved that issue. And so as a result, I was reunited with my parents. And then I grew up hearing the story over and over again of my brush with death. And it convinced me of the power of story. And so now I've got many other stories from my years since then that I love to tell when they're helpful to other people. You see, the power of a little story like that gives you an emotional connection with the speaker. It gives you a connection to where someone's come from. It's a very powerful way of establishing connection. So let me finish this episode with 4 key components that your story needs to include in order for it to have impact. First off, it needs strong characters. If you think in our culture today, if I said Harry Potter, you immediately connect with that strong character. Or maybe Frodo Baggins, and it takes you right off into the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Or from earlier days, maybe Sherlock Holmes takes you straight into, or Hercule Poirot, for those who love detective stories, or maybe Atticus Finch, To Kill a Mockingbird. It takes you straight into the story of justice, or maybe on a more dramatic level, Lady Macbeth. There's a lot there, isn't there? So strong characters really make a story. And so when you're telling a story, you want to include some of the characterization that would be a connection with your audience. The second is there needs to be a clear structure. your listeners will appreciate there being a beginning and a middle and an end. And the beginning serves as an introduction. The middle introduces or expands a conflict or a challenge, kind of like my situation in the neonatal ICU. And then the end brings a resolution that allows the person to form a connection and receive whatever truth it is you wanted them to get. An example would be that there's three kind of acts in the Lion King story. The first act introduces Simba's world, and then the second explores all the struggles he has, and then the third leads to his triumphant return and the resolution of those conflicts. So a clear structure will help your listeners to follow the story. The third part that's essential in a story is emotional resonance. There needs to be vivid imagery or a relatable experience or significant stakes in the story for people to connect with it on a heart level and not just a head level. They touch on emotion, and that's what creates a deeper connection. And then the fourth thing is there needs to be some kind of fundamental theme to the story. Because some themes resonate more broadly than others. So love or sacrifice or resilience or justice or a quest for identity or a life or death experience that needs to be resolved. All of these would be widely understood, and including one of those is often the key to connecting with your audience. So those are the four things to include in story. When you incorporate it into your communication, there's going to be a much greater connection with the people you want to communicate with. And your communication mastery really matters to me, which is why I do what I do. And that's why we meet like this every week on the Communication Mastery podcast. So you can always ask me questions. Go to my website at markberlinson.com. Use the connect form there to send your questions in, and I'd be glad to incorporate answers in future episodes. But for now, would you help someone else to discover this podcast? If you think of someone who would really benefit from the power of story in their communication, why not text them a link right now to this episode and say, hey, take a listen to this and see if it's helpful to you. You'll benefit, and so will we, because the audience for this podcast will grow. So thank you for doing that, and we'll see you back again next week for another episode of the Communication Mastery Podcast.